Ambassador Khokhar has led a long and distinguished career in Pakistan's foreign service, gaining renown both during his career as well as since leaving government as a known analyst and commentator on foreign policy and security issues. Between 2002 and 2005, Ambassador Khokhar was Pakistan's foreign secretary, before which he was our ambassador or high commissioner, as the case may be, to US, China, India, and Bangladesh. He's worked extensively on Pakistan-India composite dialogue as well as the Kashmir issue. As you discuss the implications for Pakistan, Ambassador, could you dwell also on how the China-India recent altercations affect Pakistan? And how do you think the US will respond to it? Also, could it possibly lead to a rethink of India's approach to regional security, at least to the extent of bilateral relations? I know that you're very busy. Thank you for sparing time. You have the mic, Ambassador. Thank you.
Ashok, just a brief introductory remarks about Cold War. One period of Cold War was closed with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but now it seems that there is an effort to start a new industry on Cold War. Objectively speaking, there isn't really, shall we say, cogent, sound reasons for Cold War to be happening. There is obviously a deep concern about the state of the international order. It's in flux. His Excellency Pope Francis 2 years ago expressed a very deep concern. He said these small wars are really leading to some kind of a big war. And he was actually referring to what had happened in 1914 and subsequently, how World War I started. Then, of course, Dr. Henry Kissinger 2 years ago, in a remark, he said that the world situation is very, very grave, and he's very deeply concerned. Then President Carter said that. He, in fact, blamed the United States for being a difficult country, and that because of the US policies, peace and security in the world is threatened. Now, COVID, of course, has completely transformed the current situation in the world. And there is obviously great unhappiness that the international community has not really come together on this issue. And that's also mainly because one of the principal countries in the world, the United States, that should have taken some leadership, abdicated that responsibility. The second, in my opinion, factor is US policy and the present US president, who's very, it's difficult to predict him. He's very whimsical, narcissist. And quite frankly, his slogan about America first is basically wrong. It's Trump first, America second. So I think I'm just trying to create a sort of an environment. Why Cold War now? There are two factors at the moment. One, of course, is his election is only a few months away, and he has not had any foreign policy success. Not one. I mean, his love affair with the North Korean president turned out to be, loveless. No results.
Hello.
What I'm trying to get at is, then of course he's walked out on a lot of international agreements, the climate change, the Iran agreement on nuclear program. Then he's walked out on WTO. He's walked out on Trans-Pacific Pact, and then now INF. He has walked out on INF, an arms control agreement, and that's not so much because of Russia. I think the target is China. Now, at the moment in Washington, it's great psychosis against China at the moment, right across the United States. In fact, a survey conducted by Pew, I think they said 76% of people in the United States have very strong views about China. Now, objectively speaking, what has China done? Has China invaded any country? If you look at the record, the Chinese record since 49, 62, they had a problem with India. And actually, India asked for it. India was asked for talks, they refused. So Mao said, all right, if you want war, you'll get it. And India had a huge setback. 1969 was the Ussuri River clash. It was a clash, but it was not a war. Then a skirmish with Vietnam. I'm not talking about the Korean War and the Vietnam War. I mean, China, and as far as Vietnam was concerned, was only in a supportive role. But at the moment, what is happening? It's basically the United States is under its new national security strategy, which was designed in 2017. Actually, it was prepared during the time of Obama, you know, the pivot to Asia and so on and so forth. And then it has now been refined. So during Obama's time, it was sort of engagement and containment. Now they are talking about containment. And some people in the think tank industry are talking about not only containment, but rollback. Now, what does that mean? What is happening in the Pacific? Pacific is a very big pond. I mean, you know, there's no reason for any one to be dominating. United States has been dominating, has been the principal hegemon in the world, whether it's in the West or whether in the East. But the question now is China has risen, and China has a right to find its place in the sun. Similarly, Russia is reasserting itself. It has a right to find its place in the sun. Now, that doesn't mean they want to turn everything over. What they are really saying is that we have to sit down and discuss the new world order, how it is to be designed. It has already moved. It's now multipolar, but a little chaotic. So what is really happening in the Pacific is that it's the United States that is pressurizing China. And through its own military presence, plus the United States has, a string of alliances in the area, starting from Korea to Japan and Taiwan and Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam. Of course, now the principal actor is India. So Chinese do feel under pressure, and they have now come up with this BRI, which is basically a geo-economic and geopolitical concept to break through and develop interconnectivity throughout Eurasia and open up new, and CPEC, of course, is part of that. Now, your specific questions. What has triggered the Sino-Indian conflict? Please remember that India initiated this problem. First of all, by changing the status quo of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. Secondly, the Home Minister of India made a speech in the Lok Sabha and very categorically said, we will take back Gilgit-Baltistan and Aksai Chin. Aksai Chin is with China. And then they were stupid enough to publish maps making that claim. Now, between August and March, April to 2020, China could not have acted because that area is frozen. And there can be no military operation in that area. So the moment the Chinese felt that the Indians were getting out of hand, they were building these infrastructures. and they went ahead and took what they thought was their right. And I think the Chinese are right. Please remember that on the 6th and 7th of August, the Chinese reaction to the Indian moves was very, very strong. It was stronger than our reaction. So China had made it very clear and plain to India that if you do not revert the situation, we will have to think about it ourselves. So that is one of the factors. Of course, it has implications for Pakistan. India, of course, has been relentless in its repression and conducting genocide inside Kashmir. Apart from that, it's a feverish activity along the line of control, and I'm sure General Durrani will be able to give us a bird's eye view of what's happening there. But clearly, India does not have good intentions in the region. Please remember that India is out of step with everybody in the region. I mean, look, Nepal, they've been, harassing Nepal. They've occupied their land. Bhutan is fed up with India, but they don't usually. They are too polite, and of course they're under Indian, shall we say, control. They want to. Bhutan, I know, wants to settle with China, and the Chinese are willing to settle with them. And I know that the Chinese are willing to be even generous. Sri Lanka has problems with this. Everybody in the region has problems. Bangladesh too, but of course they have a somewhat pro Indian regime at the moment. So maybe it's popular with the government, but India is certainly not popular with the people. As far as, I think we'll go into implications with Pakistan subsequently. But I think Pakistan should know that India does not have good intentions, and all its capabilities actually facing Pakistan. Now, what has happened is just one flash of history. Going back to '62, Nehru, when he got beaten by the Chinese, he sort of fell at the feet of the United States, and he wrote 2 letters to Kennedy, and those letters are worth reading. He actually asked not only for US help, but he said, please send X number of bomber squadrons and fighter planes to India, and also to take care of India's security all over. Now that is the level at which, at the moment, I can assure you the same thing is happening, because Indian-American relations have now advanced considerably, and I'm sure of course, the public response has not been very good. Trump has offered mediation 2 or 3 times, and of course, India would not accept mediation and would not like to have a mediation, Trump mediating between Pakistan and India, or India and China, and even the Chinese won't accept American mediation, because United States is seen as an adversary. In fact, United States has made itself an adversary, or is bragging about being an adversary of China. As this National Strategy Report says very clearly, that China is the #1 adversary, #1 competitor, #1 strategic competitor, and Russia. And of course, there are others too. I mean, Iran qualifies to some extent, North Korea qualifies, and I'm not sure about others. I hope we are not one of them, but United States cannot be trusted in any way. I think I'll stop here and perhaps...
All right. Since we have time, could I ask you a question? Going back to, this is an excellent explanation, and thank you. But going back to the issue of possible, or maybe we are already in a US-China Cold War. When I read American newspapers and journals, we see almost a bipartisan agreement that China is a rival, a competitor. And yet, when I look at when I learn about the economy, how deeply integrated the 2 economies are, how do you square that circle, sir?
Well, clearly President Trump tried all kinds of pressures on China in terms of economic pressures, tariffs, and all sorts. But there is, of course, a very deep relationship between the two economies. I mean, not only the Chinese exports, their trade regime is huge. Of course, the balance of trade remains in favor of China. China has a sort of a investment in the treasury of $1.13 trillion. So there is a very deep relationship. But at the moment, as I said, it suits the political presidential campaign. In fact, Joe Biden is actually trying to out-hawk Trump. There is so much anti-Chinese sentiment at the moment. And there is really, what's the justification for it? Has China invaded the United States? Is China militarily patrolling the shores of the United States? No, it's the US which is actually, please remember one thing. There are some Chinese core interests which are very, very critical. Tibet, they are very sensitive about it. It's a core interest. Taiwan is a core interest. Why? Because China treats itself as a civilization. And for 100 years, China was humiliated. And Taiwan today stands as a symbol of that humiliation because of the Japanese occupation and the maltreatment. And of course, the US was involved, heavily involved. So all the pressure points that you see are around China. Korea issue is not settled. Taiwan is not settled. Hong Kong has now been made into another issue. So Chinese feel that the United States does not have a right to be messing around in its periphery. And I think that's a very justified reason. US, the Pacific, as I said earlier, is a big enough pond for everybody. South China Sea, there's a lot of talk about Chinese. Well, yes, they've occupied some of the islands, and so have others. I mean, Vietnam has a number of, and Philippines has developed some elements, and they are willing to talk about South China Sea. But the US is not allowing these small countries to find a settlement with China. This is one of the main issues.
Thank you, sir. Anatol has joined. If you allow me, I will introduce you briefly, and then you can please begin with your comments. Well, everyone, again, Anatol needs no introduction. His book, Pakistan, A Hard Country, was widely praised, both in Pakistan and internationally. Currently, he is professor in the Qatar campus of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Affairs, School of Foreign Service, I should have said. He's also visiting professor at King's College, where earlier he was chair of International Relations and Terrorism Studies. He's also a senior fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C. Anatol's regional concentrations include the Greater Middle East, especially Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. Earlier, Dr. Lieven was a journalist with the Financial Times and the London Times, focusing on South Asia and Soviet Union, and he covered instability in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, from the frontiers, so to say. He's written several books. I counted 7 from his Wikipedia page, all works of very high scholarship. Some of them have won awards and have been mentioned and have been included in the New York Times Notable Books of the Year, and I'm sure they have found mention in other such lists. His most recent work is Climate Change and the Nation State. It's an important addition to the literature about a thread that looms large on the world. It is also available in Pakistan, and you can order it. I don't want to plug for a particular seller, but I've seen it on readings online. Also, his columns appear frequently in most leading newspapers and journals. As a well-wisher of Pakistan, Anatol has often urged for political and economic reforms, which perhaps he feels is still work in progress. I'm thankful that he's with us today. So Anatole, you've heard some of the comments that Ambassador Coker made. Has US and China already sleepwalked into a Cold War? Is a Cold War inevitable, or can it be avoided? Thank you, Anatole.
Thank you so much, Ashraf, for a kind introduction. And as an author, I love advertisements for my books. I hope that a Cold War can be avoided. Although, as the ambassador said, this is now a bipartisan consensus, it seems, in the United States, and therefore we cannot look for much change, irrespective of who wins the November elections. I think, though, one should also point out the great differences between the present situation and the Cold War. The first, as Mr. Rocha said, is that during the Cold War, America and the Soviet Union had only extremely limited economic relations, whereas China and the USA are much more economically integrated and interdependent. The second thing is that, of course, during the Cold War, America was a much more self-confident power. It was a much more powerful power, comparatively speaking. China is a peer competitor in a way that the Soviet Union never was. And also, during the Cold War, America was a much more bellicose power, not just in word, it remains very bellicose in word, but also in deed, if one remembers the Korean War, the Vietnam War, other interventions. Now, if you look at the USA today, I think it's very striking that after the Vietnam syndrome, the fear of massive casualties in an unending war never really went away. It was suspended for a few years because of the shock of 9/11 and the way in which the Bush administration used that shock. But after Afghanistan and Iraq, there is tremendous bipartisan opposition in the USA, and by the way, opposition by the Pentagon to risking more military adventures on the ground. And it's been very striking. Many people have commented on this. The difference between Trump's, bellicose, saber-rattling bluster, and with some exceptions, of course, like the assassination of General Soleimani, the absolute lack of a willingness to engage in new military operations on the ground, and of course, the plans for military withdrawal from several areas. So you are, I think, seeing a considerably more cautious US. It's important to note from that point of view that despite all the hysterical language about the Russian threat and all the talk of Georgia as an ally, Ukraine as an ally, the United States under both Republican and Democratic administrations has now backed off 3 times when it comes to the threat of actual military conflict with Russia. Once in Ukraine in 2008, once in Georgia in 2008, once in Ukraine in 2014, and then, of course, in Syria. So that, and also, of course, the Soviet communism presented a threat to elites of really every kind all over the world. It was, of course, an economic threat to capitalism. It was a threat to traditional landed elites. And, of course, it was a threat to traditional cultural and religious elites because of communist atheism. China is not that kind of threat at all. And so the United States cannot rely on the same range of local allies that it could during the Cold War. You are going to see a much more complicated and nuanced and specific and shifting pattern of local alliances, because there is almost nothing in Chinese ideology which would bar elites across most of Asia from siding with with China. However much the United States tries to build up this language of democracy and freedom, I really don't think that washes, and hasn't washed for decades. And not one of my students in Qatar, whether Arab or South Asian, believes that the United States stands for democracy and freedom in the world. So I think that despite all the pressure and the language about a new Cold War, there will be significant differences. And I mean, when it comes to India's role in this and relations with China, obviously a key question will be just how far the United States goes in supporting and backing and encouraging India as part of the US strategy against China. But two things I think should be kept in mind. One is that the Indians would do well to keep in mind, and I think actually that they do, because they also have long memories. Precisely that, when push really came to shove, the United States, talked about alliances, but then, when real risks appeared, did nothing to help. And if the Indians think that America is going to help them in the Aksai Chin or in Arunachal Pradesh, I think they will face a very, very severe disappointment. I believe they're aware of this. The second thing is that, of course, the Indians are deeply the Indians have always had, even when they were much poorer and weaker than they are now, this intense sense of themselves as a great power in the world, as almost a superpower. Now, the United States is incapable of treating any other country as an ally, truly as an ally. The United States must always dominate any partnership. And that is psychologically and politically very unwelcome to the Indians. So that will always be a barrier to a really close alliance with the USA. The second thing is that in many ways, and this isn't just true of India, it's been true elsewhere, the increasingly protectionist mood in the United States, and once again, I mean, above all on the part of Trump, but now you see the Democrats really echoing this, this in many ways runs head on into the US desire for a closer alliance with India, because it implies barriers against Indian trade, and at least under Trump, but it is possible that this will be continued under the Democrats. You see, of course, heightened visa restrictions for Indians coming to the United States, for Indian students and Indian tech workers. This has caused intense annoyance in Delhi, and this, of course, hits the Indian middle classes, not in their nationalism, but in their pockets, where it really hurts. And so I think that the American relationship with India will remain in many ways a very complicated one. And I certainly hope that the Indians aren't led into, attributing more support from the United States than they're actually going to get. Incidentally, I mean, another thing about this is that if the American foreign and security establishment really thought in terms of a Cold War with China, then, as quite a number of people have been pointing out, this would imply a really serious attempt at least détente, relaxation of tension with Russia, because everything that America has done for the past 20 years and more has been calculated to drive Russia into China's arms. But actually one sees, together with the Cold War rhetoric against China, an absolutely hysterical obsession in Washington with the alleged Russian threat. So, during the Cold War, ever since George Kennan first drew up the containment strategy, there was a real way in which the Cold War with the Soviet Union became the shaping paradigm of US foreign and security policy for 40 years, and everything else was fitted into this. We're not seeing that yet in the case of China, and I think it is still questionable whether we will see it.
All right. I mean, that was a very insightful, very excellent review. Of course, it probably triggers a lot of questions in everyone's mind. I will hold the question. I'll just leave one as a thought with you, but we'll go on to the next speaker. And that is, what do you think are the options for middle power countries or middle income countries such as Pakistan? Because both militarily and economically, in the last 50, 60 years, the world has benefited a lot from globalization. And if there is a Cold War, there will be two economic camps, or could be divided into economic camps. And what happens then? But I leave that thought with you and begin introducing General Asad Durrani, which is a special pleasure. He was for me to do so. General Durrani is former Director General Inter-Services Intelligence and DG Military Intelligence. He was also Pakistan's ambassador to Germany and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Since leaving government, General Durrani has remained deeply involved with foreign and security policy issues and is now considered one of the foremost analysts in the country on regional security. His two recent books are The Spy Chronicle, whose impact may have been lost for reasons other than the book's contents. His other book, Pakistan Adrift, Navigating Troubled Waters, has received very good reviews, I should have said. The foreword of this book, incidentally, is written by Anatol Levin. Reviewing this book, Foreign Affairs magazine says, and I'm paraphrasing partly I'm quoting, in this sardonic insider account, he portrays Pakistani politics as a formless scrum in which all stakeholders lobby and scheme with no institutional limits and no one in charge. Durrani's account is cynical and persuasive. This is what the magazine says, not myself. Not sure if General Durrani Sahab agrees with that characterization, but it should be sufficient for all of you to go to the bookshop to get a copy of this book. We can be sure of an insightful and interesting few minutes in the General's company. As you make your presentation, General Sahab, could you reflect also if the context of decision making in Pakistan lends itself to looking at the strategic and the long term? General Sahab, your mic.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was very generous of you. I'm especially happy to see Anatol again, not only because he wrote that very extravagant, if I may say, forward. I used to say if I deserved half of it, if even I've deserved half of it, I'll be very happy. But there is also another reason, Anatol, I'm glad that you're here, because you're going to answer some of the very complex questions that will be thrown at me, because the thesis that I'm going to offer is actually for a professor like you to tackle and probably understand and explain. And that is about the famous Thucydides trap. I'm actually quite convinced that because it has so much sense, its design logic is so good, that whatever is happening between the United States and China was almost inevitable. Look at the curve that the two countries have followed in their relationship. And I like to explain as to how it started from a particular point, a benign one. Pakistan actually midwifed that relationship, if you remember, 1968 over the Ham-Kissinger. We brought the two countries together because the trilateral understanding was going to be good for all three countries. The United States, because of its rivalry at that time, the Soviet Union, maybe the Chinese also at that time had fallen out to some extent with their neighbor. And we, in any case, looking at both these powers, we were quite happy that this sort of a marriage had taken place. After that, it served all three of us very well. The two countries, especially China, benefited tremendously on the economic front. In due course, America had its own worries, concerns, but at the same time also developed a certain, dependence on the Chinese economic miracle because of all that it had. And after that, it was going to be. And before I take it forward, let me also tell you another example to prove the thesis that on such occasions, such conflicts are almost inevitable. After the Cold War, we talked about Professor Huntington, the famous Clash of Civilization, inventor. Before he discovered Islam as the main threat, immediately after the Cold War, he spelled out the three major challenges for the United States. And the first one on top was how to contain the Japanese economic power. Because at that time they thought that that economic power was the only one that could challenge them in that particular field in which they were very sensitive. The result, we know what happened. I think the Japanese were untwisted, certain tariffs, certain conditions that they had to fulfill, and after that they ceased to be that type of actor. I think China probably will be presenting them, or has already presented them, with a different challenge, a different dimension of it. After that initial cooperation, it was bound to happen that when the way the Chinese, went about handling not only their economy but also their relationship, the geopolitical relationship with the rest of the country, rest of the world, it was going to raise all these concerns in the United States, because China at one stage was actually also challenging them in a field which was so critical for them, Europe, which was winning markets in Europe. So Europe was ceasing to be, the whole American continent. It became also a continent which had reasons. Like once upon a time with the Soviets, now it was bending fences with China. If that all had to happen, and the spheres of influence were going to be determined like this, the next thing that we see will also happen, and that is various alignments. If we think that today in our, or maybe certainly in the main playing field of Asia, which is supposed to be now the focus of the 21st century, we have four powers on one side, United States leading, the Japanese, the Australians, and the Indians also in their camp, and Pakistan and some others responding in the same form. We have not made a Quad, we have not made even, that Pythagoras that I sometimes not really try and define, but we, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, in one way or the other, we are also positioning ourselves how to best take care of this competition whenever it takes. Now this is in strategic terms, it's called, you can call it, the curve in which the rising powers and the declining powers clash. Or someone else they define not exactly what is happening, the unstoppable power of the Chinese economic and political, to one day go and clash with the, but it's not immovable object in the United States, but apparently it can become a very big, let's say, a hurdle, a very big block, and that type of a clash is possible. It may not happen, but it is possible. But the whole thing is to be described, and that is where I will be allowed to, differ by both the speakers. I think Cold War is already there. In the present scenario in which war is described as, the hybrid war, it is not, it's never been military only, it always has involved, the other elements. But nowadays, the entire military aspect of it has become so complex, so dangerous, so devastating, that one tries and avoid that the hottest part. But otherwise, there are these tussles, these things that go on. I also remember the low-intensity war that Pakistan and United States were fighting in 2011 in our own AFPAC area. Our people went in Afghanistan to go and target the Western or the NATO assets. Their drones regularly visited us. And someone did ask me what was happening. I said it's a low-intensity conflict that was inevitably going to happen because it was inbuilt in the dynamics of things. So right now, the dynamics of things indicate to me that type of a conflict was not yet hot, probably will not become that hot that we are afraid of, but it can get a little worse because, ladies and gentlemen, just watch out. What are those issues that we are all to rationalize whatever we are doing? CPEC, China and Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Sea presence, Ladakh, of course, the latest, and of all the things, Americans trying to express their sympathy for bigger Muslims. When was it last that the Americans were interested in anything Muslim? But nowadays they are. That means that we are almost there where we can either get into that trap or we can avoid. Thank you.
If the speakers are done, I will go to all participants and request them to. I have a couple of requests to make to them. Of course, most of you are now familiar with Zoom. You know about the raise hand icon. And if you can't see it, please scroll to the bottom of your screen. You will see participants. Click on that, and you will find the raise hand icon. Some of you have already done so, and I will recognize them in a minute. But my other request is that we want to get as many people, as many participants as possible. So please do keep it short. And at the end of your question or comment, do name the speaker to whom you directed. Ambassador Cook, Senator Lieven, General Durrani Saab. So I begin with General Talat Masood. Then I'll go to Ismail Qureshi. And then Danish.
Thank you. My first question would be that is the Indian hostility in the Indian hostility towards Pakistan, what role is the US likely to play? Of course, we know what it is, the situation today, but if things really go much worse, what sort of a role do our speakers anticipate that the US would play in that? Would it be one which would like to sort of cool down the situation, or would it like that India should keep pressing Pakistan? That is one question that I would like to have. Then what is the impact of the current hostility between China and US globally as well as on Pakistan? But I would much rather be more interested in the overall sort of the economic and the political fall and the strategic fallout of this throughout the globe. Because will it shrink the economy worldwide? Would it also shrink the strategic space? And would it also have some serious political difficulties posed towards countries like Pakistan?
Ismail, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Okay, thank you, Ashraf. Let me welcome the panelists. I must say, it's been great pleasure listening to them. It's a simple question. How does the panel, this erudite one, this panel, view the exit strategy of the US from Afghanistan, given its current confrontation with Beijing, Tehran, and to some extent Moscow? Will it increase US's reliance on Pakistan more than before? and how should Pakistan handle it, keeping in view Pakistan's current economic condition and its increasing dependence on the multilateral institutions?
Can you name whom do you want to?
I think Anatole to start with.
Okay, Dr. Levin will take that question. Danish, I think it's Danish Alvi. Danish is a graduate level student in the Netherlands. Go ahead.
Yes, I must say that the talk was very, very interesting, and some of the things with some of the points which Sam had mentioned were very interesting as well. I have a general two things to say. One is a comment. It is a very small comment, and one is a thing which would be interesting to ponder on as well. The first comment is that it can be observed that India has changed its behavior and its way of taking action from a militaristic perspective into a more legal perspective. So, for example, Article 370, they took a more legal approach to their foreign policy. And one more example of this can be seen as that Dr. Subramanian Swamy, who has extensively wrote on India's foreign policy, especially even with China. He has also now filed a petition for withdrawing the United Nations agreement now, so which he deems unconstitutional. So that's the first point I wanted to make. It's just a comment and it's an observation which I've made. And the second thing I wanted to ask is that speaking of Dr. Subramanian Swamy and his works on India's foreign policy, and it seems that from his earlier works, he was very pro-China. He wanted always good relations with China, and some of his talks also say the otherwise, that he does not like, he would not want to see a future with the United States rather. So it seems like India's right is also very much. It had a history of being very pro-China. So it's just a few observations which I have made, and I just wanted to share if there's any due context which this might be relevant to.
Did you want an answer from someone specifically?
Any of the speakers are completely welcome to.
Okay, thank you. That makes it very difficult for all. All right. Syed Rizvi.
I share with my compliments to the distinguished panel. My first question is to Professor Anatole, and I would like to ask you: do you think, Professor Anatole, the present U.S. policy is Trump specific? Right? Because I consider Trump as an excellent marketer. I myself a business professor from Cambridge. And I consider President Trump an excellent marketer who knows how to sell, whom to sell. The question is, his competitor, does he have the same skill? And my second question, Ashraf, do you allow me to ask second to the panel?
Of course, please go ahead.
Okay. To General Asad Durrani, he says that it's a Thucydides trap. In Thucydides trap, it is one power. When it tries to replace another power, there is inevitably war. Can it happen in the present scenario between China and America? Because I think the strategic scenario is not the same. Europe is not likely to be with America on it in the same way. And why did make Russia, in a world of inclusivity, why we exclude Russia, a part of Europe? Why can't Russia be treated as another part of the global economy and make best use of it? And to my friend, Mr. Coker, I would just simply say that the present scenario between India and Pakistan, how does it get affected by the recent Chinese thing? Are we moving towards a military coordinated response with China because Siachen and what Kargil thing, all these things, there's interest appears to be synchronous between Pakistan and China, bringing on to the ground response, military response. How this impact on the on ground reality. And Ashraf, last one with you. I know you must be fed up by now. My last one is, and that is to all the panels. I put it to you as my theory that Pakistan is a natural ally of the United States, being a smaller country and a smaller, dependent on America, whereas India is a growing power, which sooner or later will challenge America, and its reliance cannot be guaranteed, because on ground reality will force India to have a rapprochement with China as a big market, and all what it wants is to have the US technology, a state-of-the-art technology. So as a matter of fact, it is fooling the United States of America.
Okay, I've seen some eminent names among the participants. Mr. Ahmed Rashid, the author, Khurshid Kasuri Saab. He hasn't shown that he wants to ask a question, but Nabil Khurshid Kasuri Saab को unmute कर दें अगर उन्होंने कोई comment करना है. Anatol, this is the former Foreign Minister of Pakistan. Kasuri Saab, did you want to say something, please?
Hello.
Ji, we can hear you.
I'd be quite happy to just listen to the distinguished speakers. And unfortunately, when Jal Durrani was talking, there was something wrong with the line. I was able to hear my friend Riaz Khokar and also Professor Anatol Lieven. And there's something went wrong with the line when Jal Durrani was speaking. So basically, all I want to ask these distinguished people is, I know as foreign minister how hard I tried on the Pakistan-US relationship, but we also are natural allies of China in view of our adversarial relationship with India. How should one balance this? Because there is no way, as far as Pakistan is concerned, our relationship with China, as I said, is natural, goes back many decades. We have stood for each other. China has always stands for Pakistan, even going to the United Nations after a gap of 50 years. Admittedly, it was not an open session of the Security Council. So how would Professor Anatol Lieven or Jal Durrani, who I couldn't hear earlier, I believe Riaz Khokar has left. I would like, because I'd come with a state of mind to listen to people rather than thrust my views on people. So how should Pakistan try and handle this?
All right, thank you. I think that I actually coaxed you into asking a question. Ambassador Khokar is still here. Anatol, should we begin with you? All the 3 or 4 questions.
Okay, thank you so much. To start with Afghanistan and the US position there, it seems to me that the US establishment is under a number of pressures or imperatives over Afghanistan, which however push in very different directions. One is to avoid the humiliation that would result from a US withdrawal followed by the collapse of the Kabul state. And if the US does simply withdraw its military forces, then I think the overwhelming consensus is that the Kabul state will collapse and you will have Taliban victory, at least over large parts of the country. The civil war, of course, will continue. This would be a considerable blow to US prestige. Then, however, there is the tremendous war weariness and the total disillusionment with the Kabul state. And of course, an awareness of the way in which the remaining US troops in Afghanistan, in many ways far from being a military asset, are in fact hostages in a way. And whether or not it's true, and I am very skeptical of it actually, that Russia has been actually supporting the Taliban to attack US troops. Undoubtedly, if I think Iran, much more credibly, wants to hit at the US somewhere. Helping the Taliban to hit at the US in Afghanistan is actually the obvious and in many ways the easiest way of doing it. So these troops are hostages to fortune. On the other hand, of course, there is in certain quarters a desire to keep air bases in Afghanistan as potential weapons against Iran, China, and to some extent Russia. So all of these pressures, run against each other, which largely explains the paralysis of the US position. And of course, while Trump, very, admirably, I would say, actually did try to break this logjam by direct negotiations and an agreement with the Taliban, of course, unless the United States is simply going to leave Kabul to its fate, there has to be a political agreement between the Kabul regime and the Taliban as well. And that is, as we've seen, almost, I hope not impossible, but terribly, terribly difficult given the realities of Afghanistan on the ground. My own sense is that at some stage the political situation within Kabul itself will simply become so impossible, there will be a political meltdown on the regime side, and then the United States will just quit. But when that will be, I myself could not say. So I suspect that this logjam will continue. And of course, at present, although US spending on Afghanistan remains very high, at least by international standards, US casualties are now very low. So there isn't a tremendous popular pressure within the United States to end this involvement. On Pakistan's role in in this growing Cold War and in the relationship simultaneously with China and the US, this does indeed put Pakistan in a very complicated and potentially dangerous situation, but one which also has certain potential advantages, as we see from CPEC. Just a couple of things. The first is, I've said how India should not rely on a US alliance. I am sometimes worried by the degree to which in the Pakistani media, and actually the Chinese do the same, by this talk of an alliance between Pakistan and China, because an alliance in traditional diplomatic speak involves a formal agreement that if one country is attacked or finds itself in a war, the other country will go to war. Now, I don't think that China will do that for Pakistan unless India is actually aiming at the destruction of Pakistan. Then I think China would fight. But one does have to remember the Chinese did not fight for Pakistan in 65 or 71 or 99. The Chinese value Pakistan as a partner, but they are not willing to let Pakistan lead them anywhere in particular. I think Pakistan should remember that quite closely. When it comes to Pakistani actions against India. I think more generally, the most important thing, the most important thing perhaps of all, is that when it comes to international policy and policy towards China and the US, the Pakistani political and security establishment should continue to do something which actually it's been pretty good at so far, which is maintaining a united position on this, because the most disastrous thing for Pakistan would be if, as we saw in so many countries during the Cold War between Soviet communism and the USA, this were to spread to Pakistani internal politics, and you had the Americans, trying to manipulate Pakistani internal politics, backing certain actors as American allies against Chinese allies. That would, I think, be really, really dangerous for Pakistan. And so, it is terribly important that Pakistan sticks together in its policy. When it comes to policy towards the United States, I would say that things have, of course, got a great deal better in recent years as the United States has pulled back from Afghanistan, has started to do what Pakistan, after all, has been saying it should do for 15 years, which is negotiate directly with the Taliban and accept the inevitability of Taliban participation in government in Afghanistan. And of course, US casualties are far down. So there is much less anger at Pakistan in the USA. And I think it is terribly important for Pakistan to keep it that way and to avoid any action which would unnecessarily stir up American hostility, while at the same time, of course, maintaining the relationship with China and trying to develop on that basis as much as it can. So I would say two things. I mean, the first is Pakistan must continue in what, of course, it has actually been doing quietly behind the scenes, which is full cooperation against international terrorism, especially, of course, anything that could threaten the United States itself directly, because that more than anything else would drive new anger at Pakistan in America. The second thing is I don't think the Chinese are aiming at this, but I certainly wouldn't advise Pakistan in present circumstances to try to increase the Chinese military presence within Pakistan, at least not to do so overtly in terms of actual Chinese, formal military bases, air bases, whatever, because that would lock Pakistan into the Chinese military system in ways which would more or less ensure American hostility in present circumstances. So, I think Pakistan has to continue this rather awkward balancing act. The one thing I would say is that this does give Pakistan great economic opportunities. The fact that Pakistan is one of China's closest partners. CPEC is a demonstration of that. I'm not going to attribute blame here, but like many people, I think I've been severely disappointed by the progress of the project associated with CPEC so far. And I suspect that some of you may agree with me. The lack of a Pakistani economic strategy, which would allow it, really to make the best of these economic opportunities. I've been saying this for many years. I said it when American aid to Pakistan was at its height after 9/11. Don't just act as a recipient. Go out with a plan and try to, gain support, gain investment for that from key Pakistani partners. One of the things I would say there, obviously this is the subject of my last book, is that it is desperately important for Pakistan to seek help from China when it comes to trying to reduce Pakistan's growing water crisis, something which the Chinese are great experts, and also to build, for national security reasons, apart from anything else, alternative energy in Pakistan. So I think, that's what I would say on this trilateral relationship.
Thank you. There are two other raised hands, Yavar Ali Saab and Arya Faruqi. But first, the speakers, if you want to cover the questions that have been asked already.
Ashraf, can I?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah. First of all, somebody talked about Subramaniam Swamy. Frankly, I wouldn't take him very seriously. It may surprise people that at one time he was Ziaul Haq's darling. So I don't give much importance to it. And I can assure you that even in Delhi, he does not have any central role. Pakistan-US relations, we've had 70 years of experience. We've, it's been up and down, but we've had a sort of a relationship where we benefit, they benefited much more. In the ultimate analysis, relationships, the key is interests. It's not a love affair. It's not an emotional relationship. What are our interests? It seems to me now, of course, we would not want to be on the wrong side of the United States. We'd want them to be our friend and treat us with respect, which they have not done, and certainly not this current administration. So I would say that, it seems that the US, to some extent, has already made a choice. It has opted for India being its strategic partner. Our relationship with China, which for a long time, it has been wrinkle-free. And quite honestly, I've served there. I can tell you I've dealt with China. I was part of the person who negotiated the Gwadar Agreement. Chinese are very sincere in dealing with Pakistan. I don't think, at least to my knowledge, and I'm sure that Foreign Minister Kasuri will also share this, Chinese have never twisted our arm, whereas the Americans do on a regular basis. In fact, even on small things, they twist your arm. So what I'm trying to make a difference in the experience that we've had with the US and the experience that we have had with the Chinese. Now, my view is the Chinese don't want a war. Chinese don't want a war in the near future, or they're not really planning for one. It's the US that thinks, there's some people in the US who think that this is the time to get China. Now, that can create issues. But in the long term, perhaps there might be a Cold War situation that will turn into a hot war. Now, a country as mean as the United States, it's a very big power and it's ruthless, and we have seen this in the past. They will say you have to make a choice between China and the United States. If you are with China, then you're our adversary. That's the way the US looks at things. In fact, there was a very interesting debate I heard, and that's what John Mearsheimer said. Don't rule out the United States as a power, as a ruthless power. They will insist on a choice. Now, I hope we don't get into that situation. A time will come that we will not be able to ride two horses. So we'll have to make a very serious decision. Where do our interests lie? And I would leave it at that. In my own judgment, our serious interests are with China. They are helping us economically, they've helped us. Otherwise, no country in the world is selling arms to Pakistan. So everybody is selling arms to India. And in the last 6-8 months, the problem that we've had with the Indians, United States has not restrained India at all. Certainly not on Kashmir, odd statements, but not enough to restrain the Indians from discontinuing the genocide that they are conducting in Kashmir. On the current situation, if the United States wants to talk to China, maybe we can play a marginal role. We did play a very important role in 71, 72, but I'm not sure the US wants to use Pakistan as a channel. So I would say that we should try and improve our relations with the US. There should be a continuing interest in Pakistan's policy. But there will be a time when things get from bad to worse and the chips are down, we'll have to make a choice. As far as India, Pakistan, I'm afraid in the current environment, I don't see any positive developments. Modi is not in the mood. He's just been his His face has received a few eggs from the Chinese. He's probably, but I'm sure that there are consultations going on between the United States and China, what to do next. Some reports suggest that the United States has been encouraging India to keep the pot boiling. But how far the Indians can do that? Can they really take on the Chinese militarily? I don't think so. Not in the 5 years, in the 10 years. And certainly I hope some friends of mine are listening in India. I would say don't even try. Because this is an area where the Chinese are very strong and they are serious. And I think the Chinese would want to reason things with them. I don't think they are going to move out of this area. I don't think they'll move out of this area because the mistake that the Indian minister made by saying we are going to take it back by force. Now that is challenging, and China is a major power, it's a serious power. And Chinese don't take decisions, knee-jerk decisions. They think through very carefully. And I would really, as far as Pakistan-Indian relationship is concerned, look, there are obvious interests. We see Ladakh as part of Jammu and Kashmir. We see Ladakh as disputed also. And we do see that the Chinese have legitimate interests in defending themselves. And please don't forget, the last pillar of the Pakistan-China boundary is on Karakoram Pass. And now we don't have access to that. But of course, there's no physical access, it's so difficult terrain. The Indians had cut off lopped off that area in that sense in 1984 when they went into Siachen. So when we have to fix pillars, we have to request the Chinese to fix it from the other end. So if things really get hot in this area and it becomes a trilateral war, I hope it doesn't, because all three countries are nuclear powers. All three countries are heavily armed, and certainly it would be in the best interest for all three to find some peaceful way out. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, the two raised hands that I see, I will get back to you. You will be heard, Asad Durrani. And Humayun Saab is back here. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Do you want something now? I'm going to General Asad.
Thank you.
Yeah, go.
Very quickly, three or four points out of the way.
Go ahead, sir. Please, a little closer to the screen, because we weren't able to hear you very clearly during your presentation.
Yes, the mic.
No, I'm talking about General Saab. General Durrani.
Yeah, we can't hear him.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead, but a little closer to the screen or louder, sir.
Well, one will try one's best. I think, first of all, if you can't hear me, then of course there would be no point in my,
I can hear the General.
This is fine. What you're doing now is fine. Yes.
If people can hear me, I just have 4 brief sentences to answer to 4 points that were directly addressed to me. Thank you for asking me about the suicidal trap. That was the main thesis that I had. I think it is inbuilt in certain relationship. Even normally, the nation states, neighboring, when they have common interests or opposing interests, there is a certain clash, and that's why that famous, verdict given by President Herzog of Germany, who once upon a time was the head of their constitutional court, and he said, the nation-state system has run its course, it will inevitably lead to one conflict or the other. In this particular case, one was trying to say that because of the worldwide clashes of interest that take place between these two powers, some sort of not only friction, but the possibility of conflict is there. And that is what the suicidal trap is all about. And before I forget, at times when you have such situations, even a small spark can ignite a war that no one wants. Remember the First World War? I mean, when this Duke was assassinated somewhere in Kosovo or Bosnia, it has nothing to do with one power or the other, but it led to a war. The second point was about your, mercifully, Ambassador Khokar has already answered. No, we are not the natural allies of the United States. India probably has a strategic relationship. Our relationship with the United States was always, let's say at best tactical, transactional, or whatever. Of course, very nice to hear from Mr. Fasori, old friend, old colleague. Once upon a time also someone who was very kind to me. Sir, you asked me about the balancing. You should know more about balancing that Pakistan has been playing over the period, over the ages. We've always been trying to balance Saudi Arabia, Iran. Americans are in Afghanistan, so we are trying to, look after their interests as well as our interests, and the Taliban and so on and so forth. So this balancing game that one has done over a long period of time, that is something also inherent, that is inherent in where we are located, how this situation, how the regime is, how the region is, the so-called, crossroads of history. So we will probably do that this time also, except that we are not going to be the decisive power which will try and prevent this clash between the United States and China. We are going to be more powerful forces like Russia, like the European Union. They will probably play a bigger part. Just lastly, because it's so important, whenever people talk about the withdrawal of United States forces from Afghanistan, I think it's almost written in the wall. They will leave. One way or the other, their problem or their opposition is back home. Or, sometimes the Kabul regime does not want to, because otherwise it will collapse. Otherwise, there are so-called many different vested interests back home preventing Trump, and even they scuttle Obama's strategy. So it will have a problem there, but they will be leaving, and after that, this inevitable collapse of Kabul regime does take place, and that is where I think again our traditional role of trying to, as far as possible, take care of Afghanistan would be Pakistan, and I believe for the last about 10 years, that is what we have done. We have tried to position ourselves along with Iran, China, Russia, and Turkey. These 4 or 5 countries have been in touch with each other. Maybe they have also coordinated some strategy as to how to take care of that. Otherwise, that sort of a chaos or that sort of unrest in Afghanistan is almost inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have, as I said, 2 raised hands, and Humayun Saab. Would you like to say something, Humayun Saab? Then I'll go to Yawar Ali Saab, and then Arif Farooqi. And then I have a couple of questions on the chat box, which I will read out very quickly. They're short questions. Humayun Saab, please.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. The Wi-Fi in my house has been acting up since the last few days, and I've been on and offline today. I was really looking forward to this video conference, but I will very definitely go through the podcast and the reports. But allow me the opportunity to welcome the very distinguished speakers we have today, Ambassador Riaz Khokar, General Asad Durrani, and we're very happy to have Anatol Levin with us, and all the participants who are taking part. So sorry for not participating throughout, but thanks once again.
Oh, okay. Yawar Ali Saab, please. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Ji?
Yes, please.
Well, first of all, I'd like to appreciate IPR and the speakers to bring this important subject into focus. I have one comment and I have a question. The comment is that what Mr. Riaz Khokar said in 2013, there was no country willing to invest in Pakistan except for China, and that's when the Road and Belt Initiative, or CPEC, came into being. Secondly, what China has been telling Pakistan is not to go to war, develop yourselves. I'm sure that China would be following the same for their own case. The question is that Indian media has been saying that we cannot open up 2 fronts. So let us cool down one front, which is the Pakistan side. So if we could have the views of the speakers on this, And secondly, the Kashmir situation, it seems, has been overtaken by the COVID. So the media attention has gone very much on the COVID, and you don't hear what is happening much in Kashmir worldwide. So these are my two questions. If anybody would like to answer, thank you.
Thank you. Nabil, ये आरिफ फारूकी, इनको unmute करें.
Can I
Go ahead.
just, Ashraf, can I say hello?
Yes.
Can I say
Yes,
something?
please.
Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, I wish I had a little more time to speak on CPEC, but let me say CPEC is in our fundamental interest. And no other country in the world has given us the sort of an opportunity that the Chinese have given us. We are serious, the Chinese are serious. We've had some foolish statements made by a couple of ministers, but I think they can be forgiven for lack of understanding and any depth. So, but otherwise, we do have serious resource issues, and I think the Chinese do understand. And I don't think it is, you know, there is a kind of a campaign against China and Pakistan, especially on CPEC, and it's we know where it's coming from. It's coming from India. It's coming from the United States. But we want CPEC to go through because this is really our only solid opportunity to get into a phase of economic development. Other countries are welcome. Other countries are welcome.
I will go back. There's one person waiting, and then I will go back to all the speakers.
Now, sorry, I just want to wrap up one more.
Well, you get the chance to wrap up.
Yeah, Yavar Ali Saab has talked about, people thinking in India that, we should cool one. They've been talking about 2.5 fronts. I mean, they've been bragging about their armed forces, that they can deal with 2 fronts. So I think if anything, they should take the lesson that they have been given, a very short lesson. It's only 1 hour that they got from the Chinese. They should take it seriously. And quite frankly, you're right. Why should they open a dialogue with Pakistan? But they will not do it. It's Modi, it's the RSS, it's the Indian establishment. There are very few people in India who certainly would want a serious dialogue with Pakistan. Kashmir is very unfortunate. COVID, should not have taken away the. I'm sure we all saw that picture of that young, 3-year or 4-year-old boy sitting on his grandfather's body. That should go around the world. That should give a message to the world. But unfortunately, the international community has no conscience and there's no morality in this relationship.
Thank you, sir. Arif Faruqi, you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Listen, this is the first time I'm coming onto your web, and therefore let me introduce myself. I'm basically an economist, worked for several years in UNCTAD in Geneva and then in World Bank. So my perspective is slightly from an economic point of view. I'm 100% behind Mr. Coker's idea. I think he actually has articulated answers to my questions as well as I could have expected. The point I want to make very simply is that the Cold War that we had before between the Soviet Union and the US was a different Cold War. It was easy for us because we didn't have to make any choices. The Cold War between this coming Cold War between China and US is a Cold War where we will have to make choices. We simply cannot ignore the fact that China is our closest ally, as Ambassador Coker had said, and that US has very strong strategic relations with India as well as others, and the interest is to encircle China and also to control the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. We have a great deal of interest in the Indian Ocean. We have a great deal of interest in CPEC, and it just amazes me how casually we are taking this relationship with China at this stage. And I would really like to have your view on whether you think it is wise for us now to be thinking of a new enhanced security relationship with China going forward, in addition to the economic relationship. Thank you.
All right, thank you. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. I can't cover all because there are many and I haven't really had the chance to go through. Dr. Manzoor Ahmad, he's also associated with our institute, has asked that many developing countries greatly benefited from the trade war between US and China, and he's given Vietnam as an example. But several other developing countries, Malaysia, South Korea, and Latin America, well, I think he's saying that they gained also. So it's a comment. Also, some industrial units were relocated from China to other countries. Probably he means that in discussing the CPEC, we may have, in negotiating the CPEC, we may have missed that bus. Salahuddin Saab wants to know that how can Pakistan transform the regional tensions in the interest of Pakistan? And Fakhar Humma has two questions. I'll take the second question to Mr. Anatol Lieven. You think with China and India, the Kashmir issue can be trilateralized in any way? What, in your opinion, would be the implications on Kashmir resolution in the long run? Mr. Khalid Awan has said that US reneging on its obligation. Yeah, well, I think they've already said so. It's more bluster than reality, but you never know. US reneging on its obligations on 1.3 trillion US Treasury bond. Sorry, I want to ask Anatol Lieven, how is China likely to respond to that possibility? Thank you, gentlemen. Please go ahead. After the speakers, let Anatol come first, Asad Durrani Saab, then Riaz Khokhar Saab has covered most of the points. And then I will request Humayun Saab to close the meeting. Anatol.
Various points and questions have been made. One was whether the present US policies are Trump specific, that they will continue. I think that in most future, policies will continue. There is very little real difference with the Democrats under all the shouting. And in many ways, Biden has been trying to out-hawk Trump. So I wouldn't reckon on any major change there, except if the USA under Biden does move back to the Iran nuclear deal. But that will certainly reduce tensions, but mainly tensions in the Middle East rather than in South Asia. On Pakistan's choice, I agree that if Pakistan absolutely has to choose, then it will have to choose China. There can be no doubt about that, given all the surrounding realities. I don't think, however, that Pakistan has an interest in bringing that day, the day of having to make an absolute choice, closer. I would point out that despite the close links to China, Pakistan remains much more closely culturally and socially linked to the West. If you look at the number of students traveling, if you look at the Pakistani diaspora, and still on balance, the economic Pakistani trade depends, goes to and from the West. China has, of course, grown enormously, but it isn't a clear choice there by any manner of means. One thing I would like to say again, in India, since this latest clash with China, more sensible commentators have been saying, look, we have a serious rivalry with China. The Indian economy has to grow steeply. That's what we should be concentrating on. It is ridiculous to talk of a successful competition with a country which is 4 times your size or 5 times your size economically. I would say that, to Pakistan, in the end, the strength of Pakistan lies in its domestic strength and domestic economic strength. The relationship with China and CPEC gave Pakistan enormous opportunities in that regard. I think Ashraf used the phrase Pakistan having missed the bus there. I hope it hasn't missed the bus completely, or I hope more buses will be along, because so far, I mean, the Pakistani failure to make the most of CPEC, and also, let us be honest, and I'm sure that, you know, there are legitimate grounds for Pakistani complaint over China's stance, you know, when it comes to the electricity generation questions. But, you know, one must recognize that this also reflects Pakistani problems which go back, I don't know, 2 generations now, certainly longer than I've been coming to Pakistan, which is 2 generations. And let us also be honest, I mean, a lot of the criticism that CPEC has come in for within Pakistan has been due to the fact that, shall we say, individual interests in Pakistan have not been given enough of what they wanted as a share, something which certainly was not in the interests of Pakistan or China. So I would say that, you know, if Pakistan is forced to choose, which I think it will be sooner or later, and if Pakistan really wants to make the most of the relationship with China, it needs to see this first and foremost in economic terms, and to carry out the necessary reforms and changes within Pakistan that will make you know, a truly profitable relationship there possible. On Kashmir, it is now in certain respects a trilateral military situation. But that does not mean that the Chinese are going to attack the Indians and drive them out of Kashmir. They won't do that unless there's been a total breakdown in relations between India and China and conflict between India and China elsewhere. And politically, as long as India simply refuses to negotiate on a multilateral basis, and if, well, I mean, there is no international community now, one can't really speak of it anymore, but I mean, unless major international powers, including the United States, are prepared to bring massive pressure to bear on India, which they are not, I simply cannot see the grounds for a political solution of the Kashmir question. I mean, we all know what ought to be done, but there would have to be a completely different attitude in Delhi, and I see not the remotest beginnings of such an attitude. So I'm afraid Kashmir remains stuck. I say this with deep regret, given the tragic situation on the ground, but there it is.
Thank you. General Saab.
You know, we can start with that basic rule, and I think just now Professor Bevan has talked about it. It's the internal factor. We call it the rider clause. That is decisive, and that has been our weakness for a very long time. However, despite that weakness, there are a couple of things that could still be done better. I'm not going to into CPEC because it's been stream 5 for quite a long time. And the failures there, the deficiencies here are primarily there from inside, not because of China, not because of the objection by anyone, not because someone has wanted to throw China. In fact, there were enough number of countries, including Afghanistan, Iran, who would join us in due course, who would be prepared to join. But I'm going to just, concentrate on Kashmir. True, it's been very complex. It's not been easy to do very much about it. But look, despite all the weaknesses, after the 5th of August, what Pakistan did, I think one cannot expect that even from the most impotent power in the world. Did not raise a little finger. They take one odd speech here, and that is all that we have to come. Not even trying to do something on the humanitarian front, because I think the besieged Kashmiris wanted very desperately someone to mobilize at least the network. We did not even try to do that. Now, that it has become some sort of a trilateral issue after the Ladakh thing. No one here in the right time would say, just the time we can click the issue, go, and with the Chinese, offering that particular anvil, we will go with the hammer and take it. We are not suggesting that because that has its own implication. On the other hand, there are people who would have thought of this as another opportunity in which you can now do a trilateral on it, India, China, Pakistan, trying to find a situation in which the Indians also find a little relief because they are under pressure. Not again, not a little thing. No movement. So under the present circumstances, we are not going to blame anyone else for Palestine, anyone else for this young boy who was, crying on the body of his grandfather, because this country, because calls it the core interest, is just playing the big strategy of inaction against, the teaching of Little Art, who talked about strategy of action. He says, just sit back, do nothing, inshallah something will happen.
Mayusab, to end the meeting, I must thank everyone for joining and especially the speakers. Mayusab?
Okay, once again, sorry I've missed many parts of this important meeting, but be rest assured that I'll be going through very carefully with what has been said and discussed. And there were several reasons why IPR has held this discussion on the subject of US-China rivalry and its implications for Pakistan. And it is a rivalry whose evolution may determine how events unfold in the coming years for the world in general and our region in particular. And though the competition between US and China seems an uneven one, it is nonetheless real. And I think that so far Pakistan has done a commendable job of not allowing its relations with one country to impact on the other. And let's see if we can stay with that strategy. Very definitely of late, USA and China have visibly hardened their positions. In normal time, the pandemic would have deepened cooperation between all countries for a common strategy against the virus. But as it turns out, it has bred acrimony and a traffic in conspiracy theories. In USA, credible thinkers in academia have talked about the inevitability of a conflict between the two countries. And China too has shown that it would not easily balk. Whether the rhetoric in USA moderates after the elections is something that we may hope for, but certainly is not guaranteed. And for our region, this is a vital issue and holds a key to how our part of the world evolves. A lose-lose rivalry between two world powers that could unravel the global trade and investment infrastructure carefully put together since the 1950s, and which could conceivably divide the world economy into two competing camps, would be a setback. To begin with, it would diminish both US and China, and it would hurt all economies. And added to this is the risk of South Asian countries taking sides in the rivalry that could slow down progress in our region even more, as it is SAARC, in whatever form it still exists, is the least integrated region in the world. So these are grave issues, and that is why to discuss them, we requested the best minds dealing with the subject. All the speakers today have a very evolved sense of the dynamics that are at play. Dr. Anatol Lieven, Ambassador and former Foreign Secretary Raz Khokhar, and General Asad Durrani have spent many years actively studying and working on these issues. And I'm sure, despite the fact that I missed most of the online meeting today, I'm sure all the participants and certainly IPR benefited from the what the distinguished speakers had to say, and allow me to thank the speakers and the participants once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
all. Thank you, speakers. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Goodbye. Pleasure.
We'll end the meeting now.